Star Trek Discovery, and The Mandalorian. Both shows are new and shiny.
I like to think it makes me mysterious.
And both are making big space waves in their corresponding fan bases.
This is the way.
However, these two series are as different as a mudhorn is from a gormagander. In making a comparison of these two very different streaming series, each the current flagship of the respective franchise, we can better understand what works and what doesn't work about each. Surprisingly, such a comparison also acts as a temperature check on the state of the modern blockbuster format, the obvious spacefaring tardigrade of influence for both modern Star Wars and Star Trek. This is Mando vs. Disco. But before we get into the details, what even is a blockbuster?
Let's do this.
Okay, so here is as good a definition as any. A blockbuster is any large-budget film or series created and presented for the largest possible audience, which contains subjective levels of extravagance and loudness, can be summarized in a few quick sentences, which is highly advertised and increasingly relies on merchandising and the possibility of spin-offs or sequels to increase profitability. The blockbuster era began in the 1970s with the release of Jaws.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Actually, the term blockbuster predates Jaws, technically, as a term of warfare. But in film, blockbuster references lines of people wrapped around a city block, waiting to buy tickets to a movie, thereby busting that city block. Since Jaws, every film studio and every filmmaker has coveted some of that original Spielberg magic, and especially that Spielberg ticket sales magic. Fast forward to today, and the blockbuster is still with us, influencing everything from comic book movies to Bollywood and Nollywood, and even children's films. Right now, the current king of the blockbuster format is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a highly advertised, highly serialized, highly merchandised, easily summarized, greatly explosionized sequence of 20-plus blockbuster-style films. You'll note that the MCU is different from Jaws or E.T. the Extraterrestrial, or even the original Star Wars.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
He can go about his business.
That's because blockbusterism is not like a static set of film tropes, man. Blockbusters have changed considerably through the years. What began as a mix of deceptively simple, expensive storytelling with a hefty advertising budget has evolved into an entire film style with its own specific types of stories and visuals, going from family-friendly fare to violent adult-only concepts, to transmuting tropes from Hollywood's golden age, or adapting from books and graphic novels. Through this evolution, the blockbuster form has become a highly imitable style, an entire genre of film unto itself that can be easily evoked just like musicals, film noir, or westerns. So, what are the ingredients of blockbuster style? And why is it important to understand these ingredients for comparing Star Trek Discovery
Fascinating.
and The Mandalorian? Let's dig in.
Why don't you join me for a drink?
Are you tired of villains? Or henchmen? Or heroes? Then Knuckle Sandwich is the option for you. Knuckle Sandwich, the tried and true way that movies deal with problems. Next time you're in a bind, remember, if characters aren't punching each other, are you really even in a movie, bro? Hey! You want a knuckle sandwich?
The modern blockbuster style is defined by the following features. The primary ingredient is action, violence, explosions, spectacle, and more action. Talking about your feelings? Not in this movie. Next. Next. The blockbuster craves the widest possible audience. This format is desperate for big audiences and has, increasingly, taken to mining for established audiences to get its fix, which means that anything based on previous intellectual property with a previously established audience, be it books, graphic novels, or old TV shows, are fair game.
She was Xena, a mighty princess forged in the heat of battle.
An Addams Family reboot? Sure. But let's make the children sexier. You know, to get more audience. The Moon Knight fandom is big, right? Then how about a Moon Knight movie? They better get Idris Elba to play it.
Come along with me.
Or let's bring back the Power Rangers, yeah? Or better yet, let's combine the Power Rangers fandom with the Godzilla fandom. Two audiences for the price of one. Since a film's chances at reaching as wide an audience as possible means capitalizing on already established audiences, this means that nostalgia has become an important ingredient in the modern blockbuster. After all, the audience has to be rewarded for their loyalty, right?
Dude, is that Wolverine and the Star Wars Muppet Christmas Special reboot?
I'm so glad Disney owns everything now.
Oh, Wolverine's about to do the thing with the claws to Kermit.
Yes, let mediocrity hold sway.
This is precisely why reboots have become a staple of film in the last several decades. In this, nothing is sacred. Even the reboot of the reboot is permissible. It is worth noting that this isn't a new feature to the blockbuster style. Star Wars and Indiana Jones are partly based on classic early 20th century action-adventure matinee serials, so a certain level of nostalgia was baked in from the start.
You keep your slimy hands off her, and you grab him!
Junior?
Oh, and have you ever noticed the storylines of these sorts of films all feel kind of similar?
Smile, you son of a...
In order to get and maintain that widest audience possible, to not alienate even a single possible ticket sale, one must appeal to as many people's sensibilities as possible, which leads to simpler, streamlined stories and the recycling of the same handful of stories over and over. Something called the fleeting demographic rule. This rule depends on the limited attention spans of large audiences. Not only do the stories have to be streamlined for mass appeal, but characters have to be streamlined too. They have to be made easily understandable, simple, able to be summarized in a single sentence.
You will bring Captain Solo and the Wookiee to me.
Luke Skywalker, for example, is a farmer who joins a mysterious religious cult. The Hulk is a scientist with anger issues. Bruce Wayne is a libertarian fantasy who uses his fortune to circumnavigate the police.
I'm Batman.
Captain America is America's captain, or something. Or Indiana Jones, the world's worst archaeologist, who survives a series of misadventures. Other smaller signature elements fill up the blockbuster-style checklist. Surprise endings, plot twists, puzzle box storytelling, and now, post-credits scenes. Sex appeal of any kind is included, especially sexy villains. The sex fandom is pretty big, I hear.
I'll give you and your seed one more week. After that, if I don't have the location, we go back to good old pain and violence.
Humor is often included, but typically as quippy one-liners, designed to fit into larger action pieces.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Or as comedic takes in scenes of high drama.
I like this ship!
You know, it's exciting.
And of course, what blockbuster-style film is complete without including a spaceship or an aircraft flying through a very narrow chasm?
I told you we fit. I am not sure that qualifies.
And even the camera work and the score of at least the modern blockbusters tend to follow a particular amorphous style. Obviously, we're not including Steven Spielberg under that bus, as the man obviously knows how to have fun with a camera. Or John Williams, who is a motherfucking genius. But you can see in some more recent cases that the camera and score feel like they are copied and pasted from one film to another, without much discernible difference. This is especially true of the MCU. Perhaps the most constant element of the modern blockbuster is the unrelenting threat of world-ending stakes. In Star Wars, the good guys are always threatened with the autocratic rule of the evil empire, or the planet-popping Death Star.
Great shot, kid! That was 1 in a million!
In Indiana Jones, villains promise to use religious or alien artifacts to take over the world. Within the MCU, the threat of global annihilation, a staple of superhero stories, is present throughout most of the films.
You could not live with your own failure.
In the Kelvin timeline of the latest Star Trek films, Earth's destruction is threatened by a Romulan mining ship, a Section 31 initiated Klingon war, a superhuman madman,
You should have let me sleep.
and a swarm of B ships that were, thankfully I guess, destroyed by the Beastie Boys. Usually the stakes are fatal, even if the scale is smaller, like an island overrun by dinosaurs, a city overrun by crime, or a shark that threatens to overrun the summer tourist season.
Look, we depend on the summer people here for our very lives.
You are not going
and
to have
if
a
you
summer
close those
unless you
beaches,
deal
we're
with this
finished.
problem.
Part of the reason for the inclusion of world-ending stakes is spectacle. Spectacle underscores that blockbuster films are meant for theaters, with big screens, big sound systems, and big prices. It is a format that has come to define what a movie theater is even for. The blockbuster is supposed to overwhelm you with scale, which escalates to larger and larger proportions as each subsequent film tries to outdo the previous one. The explosions have to be larger, the threat to Earth more dangerous than last time. And the movie theater has to vibrate in tune with the scale of the increasingly large budgets, all for a chance to rattle our increasingly deadened senses. So look, a lot of this feels like we're slamming blockbuster films. That's hard not to do, particularly when we can see the same patterns in every film of this style, but ultimately, you love what you want to love, especially with movies. It is a subjective emotional experience, a film, and if you like it, don't let anyone take that away from you.
Hello?
Indiana Jones may be the worst archaeologist of all time.
Jones! I'm gonna blow up the ark, Renee.
Seriously, Dr. Belloc may work for the Nazis, but at least he knows how to run a dig. Nevertheless, Indiana Jones movies are always a wild ride.
You want to talk to God? Let's go see him together.
The reason we are even defining the blockbuster style is to help us make sense of Star Trek Discovery and The Mandalorian, the two flagship streaming series of their respective franchises. Blockbusterism is very much a component of these two properties. So, how do they follow the blockbuster framework? How do they diverge? And what does this mean for the future of cinema? And in particular, the future of Star Wars and Star Trek?
Have you ever started to watch a Trexpertise video when suddenly a rando in a Hawaiian shirt lying sideways on the beach started talking to you? Well, since I've got you here, let me tell you about a little thing called society. We live in one. Some people watch YouTube videos and listen to music in it, and a very select few individuals with supreme taste are subscribed to me. Could that be you? Well, why don't you hop on over and check out the vibes? I'll see you there. The vibes are here for you.
With the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, any movie studio worth anything has tried to copy the blockbuster formula. The reason is obvious: money.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Marvel has raked in over $22 billion since 2008, making Marvel the current king of the blockbuster style. And the result of other brands and studios chasing the Marvel crown? Saturation. film after film, year after year, all replicating the same formula and style. Trying their luck, rebooting and retooling older intellectual property in the process. It has produced an entire film era. Even with so many of the same kinds of movies flooding the market, sometimes chasing the Marvel crown can work. The Fast and Furious franchise, for example, has increasingly leaned into blockbuster tropes and been rewarded for it. The latest Mission Impossible film made nearly $800 million. But sometimes the result can backfire, as when Universal Studios tried to reboot its classic monster films with The Mummy, starring Tom I Like to Run, Please Can I Run Cruise. The film is considered a flop, despite making $410 million. There is only so much audiences can take, only so much space for this style of film in people's minds. For both The Mandalorian and Star Trek Discovery streaming series, the history and style of the blockbuster format looms large. Both shows grapple with that format as they continue the next chapters of their respective franchises. CBS/Paramount has done what everyone else in the business has been doing, taking a property they own, in this case Star Trek, and retooling it to capture some of that MCU magic that began with the J.J. Abrams film Star Trek in 2009, and continued with Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond, a trilogy now called the Kelvin Timeline films. And it continued in 2017 with Alex Kurtzman, producer from the Abrams Star Trek films, as Kurtzman helmed the showrunner's spot with Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard. Discovery and its sister series Picard contain all the hallmarks of the blockbuster style, intentionally, even though these are series, not films. There's lots of lavish action sequences and violence, spectacle, sexy but emotionally distant villains and anti-heroes.
6 years old, and all she got for her birthday was assimilated.
Plot twists, quippy one-liners.
You never forget your first, sir.
Puzzle box storytelling. And sometimes even amorphous camera work and scoring. The stories, like those of any blockbuster film, are easily summarized, streamlined for quick understanding by as many people as possible, and contain plenty of recycled elements. And this modern incarnation of Trek contains starship loads of nostalgia. Oh boy, at the nostalgia. Discovery, Picard, and the animated Lower Decks are intentionally dripping with whole nebulas full of nostalgia on a bet that viewers will come see the shows based on previous, much-loved work. Here's a hint to the powers that be. It says Star Trek on the tin. Your audience is guaranteed. Both series, Picard and Discovery, and the Kelvin Timeline films, also share the now classic blockbuster end-of-the-world/universe-sized threat, where all life in the galaxy or the universe will be obliterated if our heroes don't do something.
Across the entire multiverse.
And when it does,
Life as we know it will cease to exist.
In Disco Season 1, a Terran Imperial Universe plot to use the mycelial network for interstellar travel threatens to destroy all life in the multiverse. In Disco Season 2, the threat is a malicious artificial intelligence that wants to destroy all life in the galaxy, which essentially is the same situation in Picard Season 1, where the big threat is artificially sentient life forms attempting to wipe out all life in the galaxy. That this plot element is repeated so much by modern Star Trek alone is telling. It is a style saturation combined with the fleeting demographic rule. The effect on an audience can only be exhaustion. Maybe it might be nice to watch the characters fail and the universe implode for once, just to change it up. Which is sort of where Disco Season 3 starts, with a ruined Federation and a Starfleet crippled by some galaxy-wide environmental disaster. But in keeping with the trend, the looming threat is to the last remnants of the Federation, which must be saved or everyone everywhere dies. And there's a conscious effort to marvelize the Star Trek franchise in that each new Star Trek series is its own corner of the Trek multiverse that will, hopefully, interconnect together, just as each Marvel series of films in the MCU focuses on a different region of a larger interconnected story. And Marvel's interpretation of the blockbuster, with there being so many films in the MCU, stretches this format to a new state of thinness, reducing the varieties of possible film-going experiences down to a handful of repeated tropes and storylines, a copy of a once great style of film. And with streaming series like Disco and Picard, showrunners are producing a copy of a copy. Eventually, the constitution of the original source material starts to degrade away with each subsequent iteration. The ink is running out. The material gets thinner. One Death Star starts to look like another. And that is where the Mandalorian comes in.
Are you okay?
Have you ever been stuck in a movie, unable to reconcile an irreconcilable plot point? Do the basic tenets of storytelling prevent you from enjoying a film? Does fidelity to the real world haunt your movie-going experiences? Well, introducing Make the Movie Happen. Make the Movie Happen is the new drug from the Umbrella Corporation that allows you to ditch logic and common sense and just make the movie happen. What time zone do gremlins operate in? I mean, it's always midnight somewhere, right? And in Back to the Future, how do Marty's parents not recognize him when he comes of age? And if time travel in the Terminator franchise only allows for organic tissue to be transported, then how does the T-1000 get there? Forget all that. Make the Movie Happen is the pharmaceutical miracle that allows you to ditch logic and reason. Order yours today.
The Mandalorian diverges in its response to the blockbuster format by leaning away from the recent blockbuster form and into the original sources of inspiration for Star Wars. Mando, just like Disco, is trying to capitalize on the Marvel format in that each upcoming Star Wars series will be its own story that interconnects with the larger universe. But for Mando, the similarities with the blockbuster format largely end there. Mando deliberately pulls back from the visual and story style of the blockbuster format. There are no world-ending stakes, no gratuitous orgies of violence, no quippy one-liners, no overtly sexualized characters, no puzzle box storylines or world-ending Death Star threats, nor is there any leaning on the spectacle or scale to tell the story. Even the cinematography feels purposeful and fully formed. The Mandalorian is a child of the blockbuster formula that rejects all the trappings of its parent material, like a teenager trying to stand apart from mom and dad. Instead, Mando more than reboots Star Wars. It skips over the decades of evolving blockbuster style and pulls a direct line of influence from the original inspirations of Star Wars, primarily from a Japanese filmmaker named Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa grew up on a diet of silent films and American westerns. He went on to create one of the most iconic film styles the world has seen, which he showcased in these amazing samurai period pieces, done up in the style of westerns with silent film visual sensibilities.
A friend of mine, John Milius, actually was a huge fan of Kurosawa's. And so whenever the film was showing, he'd say, "Oh, you gotta come and see this, you gotta come and see this." And after the first one, the first one I saw was Seven Samurai, and after that I was completely hooked. I said, this is really good.
And Lucas fell in love with that style, gleefully paying homage to Kurosawa and to early 20th century action-adventure serials too, with his Star Wars films. Even his maligned prequels are filled with Kurosawa references.
And you're not going to find really a lot of filmmakers that have the facile quality with the medium that Kurosawa had. It's really his visual style to me that is so strong and unique, and a very, very powerful element in how he tells his stories.
The Mandalorian feels way more like a classic Western, lensed by Akira Kurosawa, than by anything that Star Wars has evolved into. Because of this, Mando feels fresh, new, original.
In talking to John, I asked him what should I be looking at. I know he loves movies, I love movies. What would you like me to watch? I asked him, and he immediately brought up Sergio Leone and Akira Kurosawa, Yojimbo, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so Samurai, Clint, and me.
Indeed, the fidelity of that original influence is, perhaps, even stronger in Mando than it was for the original Star Wars. The score, the camera work, the sound design, all sing in unison. All evoke very strongly the ethos of a classic Western film. The man versus the world themes. The characters have the tattered fringes of colonial empires. The unscrupulous companions that might turn on you. The towns in need of a hero. all tropes that can be found in any Western film from any part of the world. Mando even forgoes the world-ending stakes of blockbusters for a persistent worry over the fate of a small child, the very beating heart of the show, and it absolutely works.
Grogu.
Mando is not immune to the style requirements that its parent franchise helped to birth. As detached as the series is from blockbusterism, generally, even Mando fell prey to the nostalgia factor, a major component of modern blockbusters, in its inclusion of Luke Skywalker in Season 2. At least I think that's Luke. This was done to reward fans for being fans, to keep and broaden that core Star Wars audience despite the possible damage to the main Mando storyline. In trying to plug into an established core Trek audience, Star Trek Discovery chose to connect to a beloved character in a similar way, a version of Spock, something the show ultimately fumbled. In both cases, neither Luke nor Spock was needed. The core stories of each show were plenty enough without shoehorning in already established characters from previous chapters. Despite this one caveat, Mando breaks new ground for the Star Wars universe, introducing new emotional elements to the classic Star Wars paradigm of good versus evil. Like this scene from Season 2, which again evokes the emotional gray areas that great westerns like to mine for drama.
Everybody thinks they want freedom, but what they really want is order. And when they realize that, they're gonna welcome us back with open arms.
This is not a deviation, but a rededication to the thing that made Star Wars to begin with. This is drastically different from modern Star Trek, which has deviated far from the spirit of the franchise it once was. In retrospect, that franchise seems to have peaked with Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Star Trek is a science fiction franchise, not a blockbuster one. The spirit of Trekness resides in the sci-fi. And, although Star Wars, a fantasy story or period piece in sci-fi clothing, is a blockbuster franchise, The Mandalorian is leading the way to a new version of Star Wars, away from blockbusterism. This brings us to the thesis statement for this video essay, that Star Wars is a trendsetter and Star Trek is a trend follower for the genre-type franchise. When Star Wars first arrived, the folks who owned Star Trek retooled it from a wagon train to the stars of 1960s television to a big-budget sci-fi movie theater experience. Despite that promotion, and throughout the franchise's history, Trek was never deemed popular enough. Star Trek, the original series in the late 1960s aside, has only really been given the space to fully flower perhaps once in the golden era of Star Trek of the 1990s. For even now, it is being retooled to fit a format established by some other property. In this case, the specific variety of blockbusterism of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And in moments where Trek wasn't being redirected toward a new, popular cinematic trend, there was much hand-wringing over its supposed drifting from roots. Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek Enterprise, and Star Trek Insurrection, and much else were, in part, created as a reaction to the perception that Trek had somehow lost its way. Where Star Trek has excelled has been when it was allowed to be its own thing. Star Trek The Next Generation is a great example. Not really a reboot per se, but instead a rededication to the original ethos of Star Trek. The Next Generation is regarded as the pinnacle of the Trek franchise by many.
Locutus.
I am Locutus of Borg.
It is not like anything else on TV, before or since.
It is time for the white.
The same can be said of Deep Space Nine, a series that foreshadows today's modern serialized storytelling techniques. The Trek must change with the times argument is really an argument to follow the crowd instead of allowing the franchise to be what it's supposed to be. However, Star Trek has had a previous Mando-style moment with Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, which absolutely leans into the blockbuster format successfully. Star Trek II is a hell of a film, and that's partly because Nicholas Meyer and Harve Bennett and their team reimagined the original Star Trek influences, rededicating Trek from the ground up in an adept, balanced way. Like Mando, Wrath of Khan took Trek back to its root influences. So it is possible to recreate Trek in a satisfying new way instead of leaning into pale imitation. It has been done before. In comparing Mando and Disco, one can understand the scope, context, and drive of both shows more clearly. And in this comparison, one might catch a glimpse of the future of the blockbuster style of motion picture, too. Disney, with ownership of both Star Wars and the MCU, perhaps hastened by the COVID-19 pandemic, is shifting to a richer storytelling format in serialized streaming. There are a whole bunch of new Star Wars series being planned and created right now, and will soon be dominating the small screen. Something that folks said Trek could easily do if only it was so allowed. The irony is that Trek is back on the small screen, but its format borrows too heavily from tired, worn-out blockbuster-style films, something that Star Wars appears to be leaving behind.
Hello from Key West, Florida, and welcome to the end of the video. Plus 45 points for surviving this long. Well done. I'm here to read the credits, and as such, I want to give special thanks to Hank S., Alex Absher, Alex Blocker, Sam M., Cullen McArthur Jackson, Michael Goggin, and Andrew Klorlaug. Sorry, guy. I don't know how to pronounce your name. And all the wonderful patrons who make this channel happen, thank you. If you like this and other videos on this channel, then please consider going over to Patreon and supporting the channel over there. Every little bit makes this thing go and would be appreciated. Additionally, this essay was written by yours truly, with significant input from Katie Boyer, Jay Manning, and Brandon Phibbs. Ryan Kendall, Dan King, and myself did the editing, and I, of course, was the narrator. I'm sure you put that together. We'd also like to thank Rachel Marshall, Josh Roberts, Joseph Casper Baker III, Bill Schweikert, and title works were based on graphics done by Dan King. And a big thank you to Chonky Official. Go check out her space over on YouTube. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go rewatch The Last Black Man in San Francisco.
遠い将来を考えてみようよ。